Hello, General Biology, and welcome to the screencast series on Chapter 2, the Chemistry of Life, and this is Section 2.3, the second screencast for Section 2.3. And when we were leaving off, we were talking about carbohydrates, and just as a little bit of a refresher, in case you took a break and came back, we're talking about giant molecules, macromolecules, and carbon is the backbone of those giant molecules. And these molecules can form small, simple rings, chains, or complex branches. They can be made of monomers, individual compounds, or monomers joined together to form polymers in the process of polymerization. So we had seen glucose, and we left off of that last screencast. And now we're going to look at a complex carbohydrate known as starch. And complex carbohydrates like starch are polymers. They are made up of monomers, and typically those monomers are glucose. So take a look. Remember, and we've got the picture right here. Remember we saw glucose, C6H12O6? Well, that's what each one of these little individual monomers are. So we get a chain of glucose molecules that are bonded together, and this line represents a bond. And they form these complex carbohydrates. So we know that we've had starch in pasta and potatoes and corn. Starch is present in a lot of things, and that it's used as an energy storage molecule because it can be easily broken down. What we're going to find out, though, about starch is if it's not used, because it contains carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, it can even be converted into a lipid. It can be stored by the body as lipids because of its structure. But we see this chain, this polymer, this macromolecule that is a starch. So we have three classes of carbohydrates that we're going to talk about. That's going to be important for us. The simple sugars, the ones with the single ring, like glucose that we talked about, are called monosaccharides. So mono means one. We're looking at one or single. That's my crazy one there. And saccharide means sugar. And a monosaccharide is a single ring sugar. So glucose is a monosaccharide. Galactose, this is a milk sugar, this is found in milk, is a single monosaccharide. And fructose is also a monosaccharide that's found in many fruits. Now I want you to notice something. All of these are ending in OSE. So you know something is a sugar if the ending is in OSE. Okay, so that's a huge clue. So when I said cellulose earlier, it ended in OSE, and we know that that is a sugar, some type of sugar. So let's take a look at glucose, because remember I said glucose has the chemical formula C6H12O6? Well, guess what? Fructose, and I'm going to focus on fructose, fructose also has that same chemical formula for it. So you might ask, well, okay, Mrs. Saunders, if it's C6H12O6, does it look the same as glucose in its chemical structure? And the answer is no. And that's where it's different. Actually, fructose looks more like a pentagon in its chemical structure. And it's got a little smokestack that's going to contain some carbon and hydrogen and oxygen attached to that. Each one of these points that you see here is going to contain a carbon, so that's where that backbone comes in. So fructose has a different chemical structure but the same chemical formula. And when you have different chemical structures in the same chemical formula, this is called an isomer. Okay, that word's not in the notes anywhere. Iso means the same. So again, the same chemical formula but a different chemical structure. Now, when we think about sucrose, sucrose comes under a category that is called a disaccharide. Di means two. So it is a double sugar, and it's made from joining glucose and fructose together. So we're going to get that hexagon shape that we saw for glucose, and then that's going to bond with a fructose, and that's going to make disaccharides, sucrose. Sucrose you know as table sugar. This is the sugar that you sweeten your coffee with or tea, make some of your fruit drinks with, like Kool-Aid if you get the sugar-free packets to add your own sugar. And each one of these points, as I said, is going to be a carbon. And we're actually going to have, in this case, 11 carbons. Remember my formula before? C11, H22, O11. So that is going to be a disaccharide. The next type of complex carbohydrate that we were talking about are known as polysaccharides because there are several monomers that are joined together to make that starch molecule that you see. So I already mentioned to you that complex carbohydrates like polysaccharides can be found in a lot of fruits and vegetables as cellulose and as starch in potatoes. And it still has carbon and hydrogen and oxygen in 1:2:1 ratios, so it can be broken down very easily in the presence of water. So we have animals that are going to store polysaccharides, and stored polysaccharides is referred to as glycogen, and your liver actually processes this glycogen. If it's not used, that glycogen can easily be converted into fat. When we talk about glucose in your blood, if you have high levels, that's when we have diabetes, or too low levels also can be a type of diabetes. And that glycogen that's been stored is actually broken down into the glucose so that your body has that as an energy source. So for example, if you have glycogen that is stored in your muscles, that's going to be the energy that your muscles use for contracting. This is why swimmers and athletes will wind up having a starchy meal before a competition so that they have that energy source. Plants are going to use our polysaccharides differently. They do still store it as starch. We also know they store it as cellulose. And this cellulose is what gives the plants their strength and their rigidity. If you've ever heard a leaf snap, a nice crisp leaf snap, part of that is from the cellulose that is in the cell structure of the cell wall of that plant. The next macromolecule that we're going to talk about are going to be lipids. And lipids are your fats, your oils, and your waxes. Now, I know you're sitting there and saying, yeah, Mrs. Saunders, I don't eat wax. I haven't picked up a candle lately and just chomped down on it. And you're right. We don't necessarily eat wax in the form that we know of candles and crayons and things like that. But there are waxes that are in the coats of apples. So when you think about that peel, the peel of the apple, the skin of the apple, there's lipids that are present inside of there in the form of waxes. Next time you get an apple, just kind of scrape your fingernail on the outside of it and see if there's any kind of like white waxy stuff that comes off. So you do consume waxes when you're eating the skins of some of your vegetables and your fruits. Lipids also are made up of carbon as the central backbone. They contain hydrogen atoms as well, and they do contain oxygen, even though that's not listed on here. But what we see here is instead of having a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, like water, you know, we talked about carbohydrates being in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Water is in that 2 to 1 ratio, if I can write this, 2 to 1 ratio, because we have 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen. So because it's not in that 2 to 1 ratio in lipids, they are not soluble in water. And what that means is they cannot dissolve in water. They cannot break down. If you've ever mixed oil and water together, it doesn't mix. The oil separates from the water. Or have you ever put Vaseline on your hands and then touched water and it kind of bubbles up on top of that? Same idea. It's not soluble. So the idea is that lipids, because they're going to be huge macromolecules. Wait till you see the picture that we have, but they're huge macromolecules. They are used to store energy, but it's more long-term storage rather than quick storage like glucose and the sugars and carbohydrates were. We're also going to find that lipids are important parts of biological membranes. We're going to talk about lipid tails in Chapter 7 in making up the cell membrane. So they're significant. They're also going to be there for waterproof coverings to help keep water in. When you've got that lipid covering, then you're not going to have dehydration really quickly. So that's going to be there. They also serve as insulation. There goes that line again. They also serve as insulation. Women have 18% more body fat than men because of childbearing, and the fat is to help insulate and protect the baby. There are special fats in our bodies that are called, there's special chemical compounds in our bodies called steroids, and they are synthesized by lipids as well. Many steroids are going to act as hormones or chemical messengers, and what this means is that they help to control cellular activities and cellular function, as well as function for the whole organism, as in hormones. And you're familiar with hormones like testosterone and estrogen that are important in developing the secondary sex characteristics of humans. So lipids help to produce those hormones. Okay, so before we even talk about the components of lipids, let's take a look at this molecule. This is one molecule of fat, right? When we compare that to the sugar molecule, this is huge. Let's take a look and see what our chemical components are in here. And here's our backbone. We've got carbon as our backbone in there, and we've got carbon as our backbone there, and we've got carbon as our backbone there. Each one of these little lines of carbons is a type of fatty acid. And I can tell what type of fatty acid it is by the bonding that I'll see here, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. In this yellow section right here, we see another backbone of carbon that's forming, and this is glycerol. So a fatty acid is made up of monomers, and these monomers are glycerol as a molecule and fatty acids. It's typically 1 glycerol to 3 fatty acids, which will make a lipid. So when I take a look at this and I look at the bonds and I keep in mind that there's energy stored in bonds, there's a heck of a lot of energy in that compound right there, that lipid molecule. And when I look at that and I think, okay, can I break this down with water? There's just too many bonds to break down with water. So it's much easier to break up a polysaccharide or a monosaccharide or a disaccharide, because they're much smaller, when one molecule of a lipid is going to have all of these carbons and hydrogens and bonds inside of them.